Good day, everyone. So my name is Gordon Crawford, and I work at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. And this is Roundtable 3 on the challenges for participatory methodologies and decolonisation. And we have a great panel of speakers for this panel. We have Luisa Enria and Anthony Mansaray, both from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Also, Althea Maria Rivas from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And then Dan McCulloch from the Open University and Joanna Wheeler from the University of the Western Cape. Wonderful to have you all with us. We've got a hard act to follow after Boventure de Sousa Santos's wonderful presentation and discussion, but we will do our best. We've got 4 questions. I'm going to take them one by one and ask you all to give a very brief responses, just sort of 2 minutes each. So the first question is, in what ways have you tried to produce decolonized knowledge through using participatory approaches? And I'd like you to use this opportunity to say a few words about your own work, and in particular about the conference materials that you have submitted. So that question, in what ways have you tried to produce decolonized knowledge through using participatory approaches? Let me go first to Luisa and Anthony.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gordon, and thanks everyone for the invite. And as you say, definitely a very tough act to follow, but we'll try. Just to say, so Anthony and I have prepared these answers together. So we're going to take turns in answering the question. So I'll answer this one, and then Anthony will chip in, and then he'll answer the next one, and so on. So Anthony and I work as social scientists in various sort of biomedical projects and medical research projects. So we kind of situate ourselves generally in the global health field, and we both of our research is based in Sierra Leone. And so I think to kind of start answering this question, we sort of have to consider that the field we inhabit, so the global health field, and I guess many of you also work in development, which is a closely adjacent field, is one that is sort of inherently colonial. And this is for many reasons. I mean, for obvious reasons of the history of the field and the role of sort of tropical medicine and the production and reproduction of empire, but also the sort of current sort of economic and political realities under which global health operates and the projects in which we work operate. But also really specifically, I guess, related to what we're talking about here in terms of knowledge production, because the field is really dominated by certain kinds of hierarchies of knowledge and evidence, and specifically sort of biomedical epistemological approaches that often sort of ratify a difference between the kind of knowledge of the scientists and expertise of the scientists versus what is often kind of characterized as culture or misconception on the side of communities. And so what we try to do using participatory methodologies, and we discussed that a little bit in the slides that we've provided as our conference material, is to try and unsettle these hierarchies and try to kind of question these dichotomies between kind of science and community culture, let's say. So we use, for example, community-led ethnography, and what we try to do is to sort of what some of the speakers talked about yesterday, so widen the space of imagination in this field. So to try to kind of bring the voices of different groups and the knowledges and experiences of different groups in conversation with researchers and practitioners. But what yesterday was said, I think quite powerfully, that participatory methods don't necessarily equate to decolonial processes or decolonized knowledge. So, and I don't think, and I don't know if, I think Anthony agrees that I don't think that we've been necessarily fully successful yet in producing decolonized knowledge, but I just want to sort of briefly touch on 3 things that in our minds are things that we're trying to do to move towards a more decolonial process, however imperfectly. So first, through this research, we try to create spaces for dialogue. So to think about how pluralities of experiences and different types of knowledges can both challenge, but also enrich biomedical research, and allows us to kind of think through this dialogue, what a more socially just global health might look like. The second point is that through our research, we try to sort of hold a mirror against the global health research and practice industry. So that includes kind of contextualizing some of the approaches and some of the ways in which, for example, we talk about mistrust of communities in medical research in its colonial histories of extraction and expropriation. And then the third point is that we try to use this kind of participatory encounters to hold a mirror against ourselves as researchers, and thinking about how the ways in which we become facilitators of dialogue to some extent, and the way in which we use the knowledge that emerges from these participatory encounters can help either reproduce and legitimize kind of colonial structures in global health, or challenge them. I don't know if Anthony, you wanted to add something to that directly.
I think you've said it all. I mean, so in most of the work we're doing, seeing how we can hold this kind of mirror against ourselves, to try to ensure that even at the design phases of our research, the community is engaged. We try to think through our work with community participants, or researchers from the community who can actually give useful input that could make sense at that level and could capture the relevant kind of context. So yeah, I think you actually encapsulated all of that, and thank you.
Thanks very much. Althea, your responses, please.
Okay, I'll be quick. So I put up on the conference site, I put up a short narrative or short story that's from a book that I'm writing that's about research practice. And I think one of the reasons that I did that is because I think it's really important to also think about how, like, what happened in terms of how we are trained as researchers and how that knowledge is brought back in. So, you know, how do we discuss that knowledge, and how are researchers themselves, like, how do they form themselves? How do we learn about doing active research, right? And how do we teach that? And particularly, you know, is the knowledge that we bring from participatory projects or from projects that we do in the field, is it always seen as just being project knowledge, right? Or like, so knowledge that's othered in a specific time and location. So bringing it into the academy, or teaching it as like the knowledge that these people have in this specific context, which is other knowledge, and it's good to know, but in that sense, it's always othered and it's always on the periphery, right? Therefore, only relevant in their particular context for a particular set of aims or circumstances, right? Because this really leads to othering under kind of a participatory or critical framework, or research or kind of performativity. So to challenge that, one of the things that we did in 2019 was I developed a series of workshops to co-produce the curriculum, research curriculum, through a collaborative initiative with students, undergraduate students, PhD students, other faculty, and people from the community as well. So what we did is we facilitated this co-construction process. We considered that any process involving co-construction from a decolonial perspective should ensure that other voices are centered, and not just centered, but they're leading the process. So that included in that particular project, Black, racialized students, queer students, disabled students, and staff. And they were respected in taking the lead, and also students from the Global South, and speaking out and determining the direction of the dialogue and what actually led to change. And in our process, everyone was involved. And it was made clear to everyone who was involved that this change not only involved the curriculum, right, but also pedagogy, teaching methods, and a range of practices that tied to decenter other kind of like racist treatment, biases, marginalization, and othering that is embedded in the way that knowledge is produced, it's generated and brought into the academy, and the way that particular bodies are perceived as well. So it also invited not just a changing of the curriculum and thinking about pedagogy, but a rewriting the story of the modules themselves, the story of what is important of that particular knowledge, and knowledge translation processes to world that knowledge, so that it becomes not just something that is added, right, or something that we need to acknowledge exists in the world, but part of a global story, right, or part of the global narrative, the important knowledge that we all need to kind of engage in. That's the way it's way of worlding knowledge. I think our talk yesterday, this idea of ecologies of knowledge, which I thought was really interesting. And that's another way of looking at it, right? So not just thinking of participatory approaches of decolonizing as recognizing that other knowledges exist in the world, but recognizing that our world exists because of all of these different knowledges that are connected. And we cannot understand anything unless we understand this like global story in which all of these different knowledges are a fundamental part of.
Great, thank you. Very good points. Let me turn to you, Dan. Your responses, please.
Okay, so first of all, I suppose my interest, or I come to this from a perspective of having used participatory visual methods. And I suppose initially I was probably, if I'm being completely honest, to some degree seduced by some of the claims that we see about these methods, that they do something different to traditional research methods, that they're good for the voices of people that are involved. And then over time, I became a little bit uncomfortable with some of those things that I had thought about, some of those things that I'd written in my PhD, some of those claims there. And in particular, I was interested in reflecting on the relationship between participatory visual methods and voice and claims around that. I suppose also my particular focus in terms of thinking about the colonial project is probably slightly different from some of our speakers. So I suppose I'm interested, or my focus has been looking at the management and oppression of people experiencing poverty within colonial nations. So namely experiencing poverty and homelessness in the UK. And for me, this is about how people and policy constructs people as failed, as chaotic, as in need of some sort of correctional intervention. And so I'm interested in the power relationships, how they're reinforced, how they're disrupted, how we question those. And so I suppose this might be thought of as decolonial in the sense of attempting to expose the mechanics of the mechanisms that maintain those power relationships and that keep people in those positions and make it difficult to question those relationships.
Great, thank you. Joanna.
Thanks, Gordon, and thanks, everyone. So many thoughts buzzing around in my head after listening to everyone yesterday and this morning. So I'm trying to be concise and brief, and I really want to talk about what it means in practice to try to, as a researcher, work with the generation of decolonized knowledges. So in the material that I shared, the background material, there are some blog posts and also a story, multimedia story that was created through a research process, which you can have a look at. It's probably better to look at it and see it than for me to describe it. But that work came out of some research that I was doing for the last couple of years on storytelling across social divides. And it was looking at how we can use multimodal and creative forms of knowledge generation to create narratives about ourselves and to understand each other differently. And it was really focusing on the politics of exclusion, particularly for migrants and refugees in South Africa and the UK. So if you're interested, you can have a look at that background material. But I guess reflecting on that and also a lot of other work that I've done, I was thinking about what does decolonized knowledges really mean? And there were some interesting comments about this yesterday. You know, is there really any such thing as decolonized knowledge? You know, what does it look like? And I guess picking up the challenge of Professor De Souza Santos is also, what does it mean to have a methodology that is about creating subjecthood, that is about knowledge with rather than knowledge of? And I'm not sure that's completely what decolonized knowledge is, but I definitely think that's part of it. So the work that I've been doing, you know, thinking about this from a methodological point of view, it is about what we as researchers and those that we work with need to be, how we can be much more radical, I guess, in what we're doing. And by that, I mean that the challenge of the diversity of forms of knowledge that we need to engage with and understand about ourselves and with others is it's a really big challenge. And I think a little bit what you said, Althea, that how we're trained as researchers in general, it doesn't really prepare us to think about that. And there is a lot that is already inscribed in the way that we are trained as researchers, whether it's in the global south or the global north, that is already really predetermining the frame of what constitutes research and of what kind of knowledges we are able to work with. And so I'm interested in methodologies that that layer different forms of knowledge onto each other, and work with embodied aesthetic and political forms of knowledge. So I would position this very much as a feminist undertaking as well as a decolonial one. If those are separate, I'm not sure if they're separate. But yeah, I guess that what that means is that where the research is going is not predetermined, and it has to be negotiated. And that negotiation is not only an analytical process, it is also a creative process and an embodied process. So in practice, what that means is that all of these different modalities of knowledge become part of the research process itself. And therefore, what we see as the research process changes. And I guess at the same time, it makes you as a person question a lot about how you see yourself too. So it's not just about what other people do, it's about what it asks of us as individuals in the process. So if I had to try and articulate what it is that it's doing, it would be that. And I don't really use the language of participatory methodologies for that, but we can talk more about that in one of the other questions.
Great, thank you very much. I think how can we be much more radical is certainly a key question and a key challenge that's arisen, well, both yesterday and especially today. So thanks very much for those very interesting reflections on what you have done. So following that comes the inevitable question of what have been the challenges and limitations that you have encountered, and how have you tried to address them. So let me return to Louisa and Anthony for your responses first.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Let me start with where Joanna left off, that we shouldn't actually always predetermine the direction of how research should go. If I can paraphrase you, Joanna, allow me to. And I think when we talk about community participation in research, we shouldn't do it for the sake of doing it. And this is what I've seen as one of the greatest limitations, because we see a continuous presence of Western researchers conducting research within context that they know little or nothing really about. And we have all these, these trainings and these creative and innovative ideas on how research can be done and should be done properly. But then we forget that there are cultural and contextual nuances that can always redirect or have an impact on how we can view knowledge as a whole, and how we can generate knowledge as a whole. Let me give you an example on one of the projects I worked on during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and in Sierra Leone. So through the London School, we had to do a contact tracing study, and this was a very novel idea of using mobile phones to do contact tracing in certain districts. It was applauded because the idea was to see how we can have data in real time about certain indicators, health indicators, which are really vital signs of Ebola, and surveillance data as well in real time. And this was meant to be tracing contacts of Ebola infected persons on a 21 days period, and that data should be sent in real time. Now, the contextual and practical challenges with that was that, of course, we forgot to think about the fact that these are remote communities and people are not really familiar with smartphones and connectivity issues and all that. And we wanted to use community health workers within these communities to use smartphones to do contact tracing and send us data in real time. Now, you can imagine within this kind of context, the million things that went wrong. And of course, this is something we didn't think about when we were conceptualizing the project. So I believe, that in as much as community participation is quite important, but it could also be a major limitation. But what is more so a limitation is failing to conceptualize and implement research without taking into account the local context. And we should actually ensure that research is designed and implemented within the local context. And I totally agree with Joanna on her saying that research should be negotiated. And that, I think, is the best approach. I think I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you. I'll move on to Althea.
I had a list of things, but I think one of the big things besides finding funding for different and kind of radical research in the UK, which is always a challenge, I guess, is the difficulty with reflexivity. Because I talk less about kind of participatory methods and more about social justice and decolonial methods. But of course, I think yesterday there was a long discussion about how those things link and interact. So I won't go through that again. But I think part of these approaches is seriously engaging with power and politics and being reflexive. And I think there is a tendency in the academy to look at that in a particular way. And these are particularly, the issues around decolonizing knowledge. These are really difficult conversations. And so I find often it's either people can be really critical, but then they often don't want to just engage with the field at all, right? So they're more into the theorizing part of it, or people who are engaged in field work are only willing to go so far, because really when you get down to the heart of these issues, it involves shifts in power that people are often not willing to give up, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that decolonizing knowledge or changing or transformative knowledge production actually involves kind of shifting our own positions, giving up power and space. And that's something that it's a continuous practice, right? And I think that is perhaps the biggest limitation that I've come across.
Thank you, Althea. Dan.
Yeah, so I also had a list of things, and I think some of this is probably been picked up across the 2 days already. I think for me, it's dealing with some of the contradictions. I sit in a department of criminology. Criminology has a long history of producing very damaging colonial knowledge, racist, sexist, oppressive knowledge. I'm also part of a university that's benefited from colonialism, and I benefit through that myself. And that kind of leads me to another issue that I think was picked up yesterday about the potential for co-opting of these ideas and narratives into what already exists, and then the kind of diluting of them and the inability to then disrupt what already exists. So if I pick up an example from my own kind of day-to-day work, if we think about criminology and we talk about crime as this quite damaging discourse, this thing that serves to reconstruct existing power relationships, social harm has been talked about as an alternative. And as my colleague Lynn Copson points out, actually social harm can be co-opted quite easily and arguably has been in some ways. So there's a danger that then it becomes limited. I think then there's the wider contradiction of being part of a system that reinforces these relationships, and there are questions about whether we try to reform that or try to abolish it in some way, and what that means, what the implications are of that, and what the right approach is. And then there are difficult questions, I think, for me about my privilege, how I use that privilege and what that means, and also the limits that I have. Sometimes I think we can talk about power, but one of the things that I found was that when I was talking to people, they thought that I had the ability to change national policy when I was talking to people, and I don't kind of overnight, if at all. So it kind of puts me in a paradoxical position where in some ways I'm seen as having power and having quite limited power. And then I think there are things to do with the process, the things to do with funding, things to do with consent. So for example, I think this was picked up yesterday about consent forms, quite a formal process. I think they can reinforce power relationships. And of course, consent matters, but in the way it's often constructed, I think that's about litigation for universities rather than about a useful relationship for people. Information sheets telling people how they will benefit from a project. In a truly participatory project, I'm not sure I can say what the benefits are at the very beginning of that. And publication, even with that, talking about people in quite homogenizing, uniform ways, that kind of reduces the complexity of these things. And then I think coming back to some of the things that Althea spoke about, and I think Joanna picked up about the training, emotions, friendships, these things that actually we aren't really, don't talk hugely about. And then for me, the final thing is probably about a disconnect between what we do in institutions and how we talk about it, and then what that means on the ground. So when I talk about voice, actually, when I was talking to people about voice in a day centre, which is where I kind of have been doing this, voice was quite clearly a bit of a jargon term, and it took that engagement to actually kind of say, oh, what does this mean outside of the conversations that we're having about this inside of the academy? It wasn't about nuances in that. It was, what is this thing, voice, other than me talking? So I think that for me, that's kind of a very quick run through of quite a lot of those challenges and limitations, but I think there are a whole host more.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Some good points there. Just let me say, I think certainly the origins and the original aims of the Open University is somewhat more progressive than other institutions that many of us are in. Thanks a lot. Joanna.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I really agree with what has been said so far. And I think everyone has touched on a lot of the things that are on my list, which is good. So I want to maybe add one other thing, which is a slightly more theoretical point, but I think is also an interesting and important limitation to think about. And that is that in a way it relates to, a lot of those critiques of participation as being a form of tyranny, and as sort of reifying existing, inequalities and oppressive structures. And I think that one of the reasons why that happens or can happen in a participatory approach, or indeed in other forms of research, is that there's a dominant logic of aggregation that's at work. So, in a sort of classic participatory methodology, you go ask everyone what they think, or you ask everyone what the question should be, and then they ask each other what they think. You add up all the answers, and that gives you what you're looking for, right? It's a logic of aggregation. And if we have a much more complex approach to understanding knowledge, then aggregating knowledge like that is not going to really work. It doesn't work, because what it does is it reinforces the existing categories. It doesn't allow us to have enough nuance. It doesn't allow us to bring in the slipperiness of the world that we are in, of the experiences that we have. And so I think, I think one of the limitations is, how do you work methodologically with a different logic of representation that isn't just assuming that people are blocks that can be added up, or view that opinions or what can be added up. So I guess, I think what that means is, how can we work with a more refractal understanding of representation of knowledge that doesn't strip away those complexities. And just to give like a really quick example of what I mean by that is that I've worked in a lot of processes that are trying to connect radical, forms of knowledge from the margins with people who have been marginalized in different societies, into policy processes all the way at the global level, a bit like what you're describing, Anthony and Lisa, in global health. And what often happens is that a participatory process is used to generate stories or material, anecdotes, and those stories or anecdotes get decontextualized and used to justify agendas which are decided elsewhere on their behalf. And that is a really persistent problem, and we as researchers do it as well when we take people's experiences out of context and publish them in different ways, or share them in Zoom calls with colleagues. So how do you keep the complexity, how do you keep the complexity in? And I think that it means thinking differently about how we go about representing knowledge, I guess. Yeah.
Good, thanks very much, Joanna. There were two more questions, but I'm not sure we'll have time for the fourth one, which was on knowledge democracy. So just let me turn to the third question, and then after that we will have some time for Q&A. So the third question relates to the critiques of participation as tyranny that Joanna referred to in the beginning of her previous response. So the question is the critiques of participatory approaches, such as being tyrannical. In what ways have you addressed such critiques, and in what ways can participatory methodologies remain transformational in terms of knowledge production? Or alternatively, if transformation is not possible through participatory methodologies, then what alternative approaches would you highlight in terms of contributing to decolonizing knowledge production? Let me turn to Althea first.
Yeah, I have a couple of quick points. One of the things that I think is important is the concept of time, right? So often researchers, even regardless of the method, whether it's participatory, ethnography, or whatever it is you're doing, you go in, you engage with a particular community, you might engage with them over, a year or two or a period of time. There is something that comes out of it. And then, the dissemination or the products go in different places. And then you move on to other things, right? So I think one of the things for me has been developing long-term relationships and trusting relationships with the communities and also the research organizations that I work with in different places. And in that sense, it kind of responds somewhat, but not totally, to what Joanna was raising about, like, kind of the way that we think about the complexities of knowledge and how that changes over time, and looking at it as something that's not necessarily static, and also that knowledge is tied up with things like affect and emotion, right? Which I think Daniel mentioned as well, right? So it's allowing ourselves to understand that and to learn and unlearn through a long-term process, right? And engage in the complexity of those things. And then also working with the research organizations in particular that I work with over time to develop their own projects, because they're often caught in a cycle where they can only respond to development policy objectives, right? Or donor objectives, right? So thinking about what their research agendas would be, and what the important issues for the organizations are, for their communities, how they want to, the story that they want to tell about their own context. And that is, in every situation that I've worked in, completely different than kind of the donor objectives around policy as such. Sometimes it's related, but that's not where it starts. And really working with them to see how they can then, build those things and not just be tied into project cycles or the requests from Western researchers.
Great, thank you. Important points about long-term relationships, but of course, as a number of us have experienced recently, these can be undermined as a stroke by the funders when they suddenly withdraw or cut funds, but that's another story. Louisa and Anthony.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sort of nodding vigorously to everyone's points there. Yeah, exactly the sort of things we've been thinking about. I'll say a couple of things quickly and then leave Anthony to add some things he was going to say in the next question. But when I'm sort of thinking about sort of the transformative power of these relationships and this dialogue, I guess, especially in relation to the field where we worked, which we've already talked about, I think there is one tension that I'm constantly thinking about. And it's on the one hand, that through these kinds of dialogues, there are articulations of really explicit articulations of an expectation that the knowledge that is produced in this spaces is then brought up or kind of amplified, I guess, and that it leads to some kind of tangible outcomes, right? So people who we speak to and we engage with in dialogue want explicitly their voices and experiences to be included in discussions about what health looks like in their areas and the places where they live, but at a global level too. But then, of course, there's an intention, the danger that kind of participation, exactly these kinds of dialogues are then co-opted to kind of legitimize, I think, as Joanna was saying, to legitimize other agendas, or that the difference of epistemologies or difference of experiences are kind of flattened out by these kind of urgency and kind of requirement, especially in global health, to make everything operational and everything something that can be acted on, right? So I think that's kind of where the tension for me is about kind of how to make sure that these dialogues can be transformative in any way. And again, I'm not sure that we've sort of got a solution to that, but I really agree with Althea's point about, that the starting point is about listening and especially about building really meaningful relationships over time. And we've been lucky to be able to do that over a long period of time in the communities where we work. And that's not always the case, but I think it does make a big difference if research isn't episodic and extractive in that way, but it's a constant discussion, a constant dialogue. But the last thing I wanted to say is that I'm also a bit wary that we shouldn't, at least in my experience or in my perspective or the field where I work, that we can't think about these kinds of processes becoming transformative simply by doing research better, right? And that I think that that we have to attend to the much bigger kind of forces that we've all been talking about, this sort of structural and historical legacies. And so I think for me, in terms of what kind of processes do we need to engage with, it's about like really actively and explicitly repoliticizing this space, which I think we've been doing, or even through these conversations over the last couple of days. But sort of repoliticizing participation or dialogue or knowledge production and kind of thinking explicitly about what this means in practice. But Anthony, if you want to add to that, since we're cutting out the next question.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. So one thing I just wanted to add was give an example of how that can actually go really bad in some ways. So I worked in my early career days, I worked on a reconciliation project which builds from the model of restorative justice to bring victims and perpetrators together in one room and have them do some reconciliation. But we were to do an RCT, a randomized control trial, to put communities into treatment and control. Now, the only word that the researchers could find then, that is including myself, was to say vote in Creole, which actually means someone has to win and someone has to lose for the community people. So at the end of the day, the community decided, after the researchers left the randomization processes, they decided, okay, you won and I lost. Let's come together and make this work together. So even communities that were supposed to be in control group ended up being contaminated because they also participated in the intervention. So that's how really things can go wrong. And if you don't think about different ecologies of knowledge and different interdisciplinary approaches. And for now, I mean, as Louisa rightly said, these are some of the things we are trying to put in place now. So fast forward to the trials, the Ebola trials we're doing, vaccine trials we're doing in Sierra Leone. We'll try to have a social science team within embedded within the trials. We've tried to have community liaison teams embedded within the trial, just to make sure that communities are fully engaged, that they fully understand. And these are all led by locals who actually understand the context. And I think it is really, really key that we think about research that way.
Yeah. Great, thanks very much. Over to you, Dan.
So I think what I was going to say is lots of it's been covered already. I think for me there are kind of a few things that I think are important from this. So I think for me this comes back in some ways in terms of thinking about the kind of power of the discourse of participation to questions about what we construct when we are trying to deconstruct something else and what the implications of that are. So what it means to be involved in that and then the implications of that. I suppose in other ways, I think there are things probably coming back to what Althea said about time. I think there's also an importance in recognizing that relationships change and people change over time, and that some of these aren't static. And that within a project, I think there's an importance or a need to avoid essentializing people that are involved as a homogenous group. So within a project, I think people want different things. People are engaged as individuals just as we're engaged as individuals. People might subvert things. People might want different things over time. Their motivations, their desires change over time. They might change their minds about being involved. And also, I think the other thing is for me, is about, I suppose, at times allowing to kind of be exposed to critique, to not kind of be saying, well, we're doing transformative work because I've written that I'm doing transformative work. To ask people that are involved and people that are our peers to kind of ask and talk about the difficulties, the things that went wrong, the things that didn't work, as well as those that we feel did work. But also to kind of ask people, what did you feel worked? What did you feel didn't work? So it's not just us leading that narrative.
Great, thank you. Good points. Joanna, can I ask you to be brief, please, so we can go on to the Q&A?
Yes, I'll be really brief. It's good going last because all of the brilliant speakers before me have covered so many of the points. I don't need to say anything about them because you've all done it much more in a more articulate way than I would anyway. But I guess one thing that I wanted to add is about this idea of dialogue. It came up yesterday. I think it was Anna Cecilia who was saying something about, you said something about dialogue and what it is and why we need it. And I'm interested in this is one of the challenges of participatory research, you know, it speaks to your point, Althea, as well about, you know, how do we repoliticize it? Because definitely within development, you know, within the sector where I started out working, you know, who participates? Well, it's the people who have no other choice really, but to participate in, you know, a process that's about what they want. Let's say we're looking at like a poverty reduction strategy paper by the World Bank. You know, it's the people who don't have power in other ways to influence what is happening that are then forced to spend all their time in workshops, you know, telling researchers what they think about something, and actually what is at stake and what is at play is very small in comparison to the decisions that are affecting people's lives and where the power lies, and the participation around those things is much thinner. So, you know, do we then as researchers, if we are using a participatory approach, are we just taking up the people's time and resources on things that don't really matter that much? And I think that that is a real risk in participation. It is to do with the framing. And I guess the challenge that I have been trying to work on myself recently is, how do we make the research and the participation within the research be something that is crossing these sorts of divides, that is going across the people who are not at this conference, who think that the idea of decolonialism is just a storm in a teacup, you know, or snowflakes, you know, getting together on Zoom, or whatever whatever the critique is. How do we talk to that? How do we talk to each other? You know, what is the role of research in making connections across those kinds of divides? People who are positioned very differently and who don't have a language to speak or don't have a way to speak to each other. And I think that's the kind of dialogue that we need to be having, and it's not without its costs. It's a very high stake process that is not going to be easy. But I think, yeah, looking at the political landscape that we find ourselves in, that's what we really need.
Great, thank you very much. Some very good points there. Highlighting some of the shortcomings and challenges and indeed failings at times, and potential ways to address those. Let me turn to the questions now. Okay, a question from Sylvia Sergi to all of the presenters. How can we researchers manage to try to do decolonial research, knowing that in the end, we still are the filter through which the stories are told, that every experience is mediated from us or through us?
Great, thanks, Gordon. Yeah, how can we, I guess, there's always a filtering process, right? So even if you're having a conversation with someone, there's a filtering process. So for me, it's not just like, recording stories and then transcribing them and putting them out there and saying, well, because this has been transcribed word by word, then the power dynamics have been stripped from it. It goes back to, I think, what all of us said several times during the talk today. It's really about power and politics, right? It's asking yourself, like, what is the purpose of what you're doing? How have you engaged with or tried to dismantle or recognize or shift the power hierarchies that are here? How are you centering this knowledge? What is left for the community or the people that you're engaging with? What is their role in this particular kind of project, right? So it goes beyond just regurgitation of particular stories, right? Because I think that regurgitation of particular stories is often how researchers are validated sometimes with participatory approaches. Like, so I went to the field and I talked to all of these people, and now I can tell you what they said. And then that is seen as a validation as opposed to engaging with the politics around that process, right? So I think it's more than just how do we record or reproduce particular stories. It's about the politics and power embedded in how those things happen.
Great, thank you very much. I think politics and power are certainly key issues that have arisen today. Any other responses to this question concerning sort of filtering process and how that can be decolonial or not?
Can I just say briefly two things? I mean, one that I agree entirely with Althea's points, and I think one of the main things is if we are to remain the filter, then we kind of we should ask ourselves, what filter do you want to be, right? And maybe it kind of comes back to that question that Professor De Sousa Santos talked about this morning, what side are you on? And so it's also about, I feel like a huge responsibility, I think, collecting stories from people over a long period of time about what you do with those stories. But then really quickly, just also to say that we don't always have to be the filters. And I think Zainab's film, for example, that she talked about yesterday is a really good example of the fact that there are lots of different ways. And I think, for all the problems that there are with Zoom and everything else, it's also created new spaces, I think, for different people to participate and to create new spaces to listen to different types of voices.
But I think for me, just quickly, I think it's also about recognizing that we aren't the only filters. So probably coming back to some of what's been said there by Althea and then by Louisa, kind of what filter do we want to be, but recognizing that there are different types of filters, and there can be some very damaging filters, as well as those that are supportive, and asking questions about what that means.
So we have a question stroke provocation from Peter Keogh, and I think this probably arises after Professor Santos's talk this morning. Is there any mileage in reviving good old-fashioned Marxist and feminist ideas of making common cause, quotes unquote, across marginalized peoples in both global North and global South settings? Her response is absolutely, but not quite the same, as we need to rescue the capacity of feminism and Marxism to de-Euro-centralize themselves. I'm working on this.
Yeah, I suppose from my thinking, I think I suppose there's perhaps a value in drawing out the ways in which some of the mechanisms of thinking about the way in which colonial power reinforces itself and is self-sustaining. I think there's a value in it for exploring some of those mechanisms and exposing some of them, and then trying to ask, okay, well, how do we question, critique, try to deconstruct these? And that's where I perhaps see a value, yeah.
Did they die, so they need to be revived? I'm not sure. I think they but yeah, I guess if, you know, taking what I was saying before about dialogue across positions, I think that is the challenge. You know, if we're thinking about a Marxist or a feminist idea of common cause, how do we create that in the current moment that we're in? Who creates it? How does that happen? And I'm really interested in the way that recognizing and visualizing the everyday experiences allows us to find different axes for what that common cause can look like. I guess it's a little bit what Boaventura was talking about, you know, when he describes this methodology of bringing together lots of different people from different positions and trying to find a common cause. I guess that'd be one way of describing it. Or, you know, there's ATD Fourth World has a similar methodology, which is called merging of knowledges. You know, there's different, you know, organizations that are working with this. But I'm interested in like the more micro aspect of that, which is about how we really connect the personal and the political. And what is being lost, you know, what is not being seen, as just D'Souza Santos started out in his talk by saying that so much of life and of the world is not visible in, you know, in what we see in the news. And I think that's really important. And we can all think about that in terms of our own experience, you know, our own experiences in the pandemic as well. And, you know, so how does that allow you to make different kinds of connections? We need to be much more creative in how we do this.
Thanks very much, Joanna. We've run out of time, so let me draw this session to a close by thanking all of the panelists for some very, very perceptive and interesting points in how we looking at the challenges for participatory methodologies and decolonization and how we can take this agenda forward. So thank you very much, everyone.